Well, hello, my name is Troy Lanigan. I'm president of the Canada Strong and Free Network. I want to welcome you all to March's exchange call. First and foremost, we could not do this without sponsorship. So a very special thank you to our friends over at Modern Miracle Network. This is our first exchange call in which we're partnering with a group outside the country. So let me recognize and thank Lorenzo Montanari and Phillip Thompson from Americans for Tax Reform. Specifically, the initiation of this cross-border call is related to two important projects of Americans for Tax Reform: the Property Right Alliance, which will get put into the chat box, and the International Trade Barrier, a report undertaken by Property Rights Alliance. I also want to recognize and thank my good friends Jocelyn Bamford and Bess Sobot from the Coalition from Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada. Put their link in the chat as well, who are again partnering with us on this call today. Finally, I want to thank our outstanding panelists who we'll be getting to very shortly. Just a couple of quick housekeeping matters before we get started. First of all, we've had the chat function shut off on these calls the last few months because of disruptors, but we are going to turn it back on today and see how it goes. If it becomes polluted by you-know-who, we will shut it off, but hopefully that's not the case today. We are monitoring it the best we can. The chat is for commentary and networking. If you find it distracting, you can turn it off. The question, the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of your screen is for questions. We had a lot of questions come in before this event, and with 4 panelists and a guest we added late, I'm not sure how much time we'll have for questions, but we'll monitor it and we'll see how we're doing. Second, we had well over 800 people register for this event. That's a tremendous turnout. If you enjoy these calls and the content, I want to quickly take this opportunity to invite you to our largest event of the year, the Canada Strong and Free Networking Conference, which is taking place on April 10th. I'll ask for that link to be put into the chat as well. Finally, because everyone asks, yes, this Zoom call will be recorded and posted on our website within an hour of us finishing up today. Okay, that's enough from me. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator today. Really happy to have Danielle Smith back. We had her last week on the other side of the microphone, so pleased to have her leading our discussion today. Thank you so much, Danielle, for doing this. We'll probably go a little bit longer today because we do have up to 5 people that'll be saying a few words for sure. So let's plan to go for a quarter past the hour. And Danielle, at the end, if there's time, I've got a little bit of a call to action. So with that, thank you, everyone, and I'll turn it over to Danielle.
Fantastic. And I won't take too much time to set this up, but I think it's important maybe to bring us all onto the same page of where we're at on this issue before we get to our excellent lineup of speakers. I should also mention we've got 2 very busy politicians, Congressman Pete Sessions, as well as Minister of Small Business and Red Tape Reduction, Prabhat Sakaria. They're both in the middle of doing a bunch of other political stuff. So we're going to get to them first and then also do some Q&A, and they'll be able to join us afterwards. But let me tell you, first of all, how we kind of got to this issue. I think we all heard back in October that the government was going to make good on its promise to ban single-use plastics. At the time, those were identified as 6 different areas: grocery bags, stir sticks, 6-pack rings, utensils, straws, and what they're defining as hard to recycle foodware. But I think the deeper problem that may have gone a bit missed by the general public is in doing so that they're changing the Canadian Environmental Protection Act to declare plastics as toxic. So that puts them in the same category as lead and arsenic and mercury, which, when you think about it, the fact that we've been wearing these things that are made of plastic on our faces for the last year, it seems odd that it would have that kind of categorization. Now, the categorization has enormous trade implications. And so there has already been a lot of activity on both sides of the border. There have been 500 submissions and several hundred letters going to the Environment Minister to ask for an inquiry into this and to try to change that categorization. In the US as well, there have been 100 companies that are going to be directly impacted by this. It may also be a violation of the USMCA or CUSMA, however it is that you like to say it, Chapter 12, and it will have a huge implication as well on investment in Canada. So those are all the things that we're going to talk about today. What started off, I think, is a relatively small and narrow issue, I think, in the way it's being defined in the general public, could turn into a massive, massive impact on a $35 billion industry that employs tens of thousands of people across across North America, both in Canada and the United States. So let's get right into it so that we can map out some of these issues and then see what the solution might be. We'll begin with the American Perspective. Texas Congressman Pete Sessions has been serving Texas in Congress for over 22 years, and he represents Central Texans, serving the 17th Congressional District of Texas as a Republican. His constituents will be directly impacted should this label come through, and he joins us now to tell us why that would be. Congressman Sessions, please take it away.
Danielle, thank you very much. And Minister, thank you for taking time to join us. In fact, today's discussion is quite serious. It is serious because it is governments that I believe are fundamentally opposed to free enterprise. And certainly in the United States, you are all aware we've had arguments about the direction that the United States is going to go, and the implementation of rules and regulations and laws, not just by Trudeau administration, but Canada as how it's seen, and now the President of the United States, Mr. Biden, and how the world sees that effort. First of all, I want to say thank you to each of you who are in the free enterprise system. The free enterprise system is the strongest system in the world that creates not only more jobs and opportunity, but also technology and investments that are available to make people's lives better. I want to go back, if I can, to about 1989 in the United States, when my father, Judge William Sessions, was the FBI director, when across our country we had problems with Tylenol, where people were putting things in Tylenol that were poisons. The free enterprise system from my father generated new packaging guidelines that were there for safety and effectiveness, not only for the product, but also to help consumers. I think that where we have come through time and technology has really built across our two great nations a reliance of each other, not just in Canadian companies that reside in Texas, and certainly our ability as the United States to do business with Canada on a whole lot of products, but in particular, this area that we're focused on today is one that is there to create safety and health opportunities to make sure that whatever is in that package is properly delivered with its freshness and its safety elements, as well as the availability for it to fit within trucks, the just-in-time delivery system. This is all designed to the benefit of not only the consumer, but also to the effective pricing and delivery processing. Our companies that reside with each other and the interaction between us with international trade has really set standards for the entire world. Now we are faced with what I consider to be also a challenge. I'm an Eagle Scout. I spend a good bit of time in our mountains and our streams, in our oceans, and I don't like seeing what might be dirty oceans or plastics in the ocean. But what I would suggest to you is that because of effective environmental concerns that we have in place, including where we recycle our products and insist that the products that we use are recycled numerous times, to where a piece of plastic or plastics that is put together are reutilized numerous times, is a real answer to not only environmentalism, which I call conservationism, but it allows us to effectively use and multi-use these resources. Here's my message to you. The United States of America is going through a struggle just like Canada is. And it is a struggle between essentially what might be the free enterprise system or the free market, including people's freedoms of opportunities to even work without government interference. Forget the pandemic, I'm talking about rules and regulations that are placed on us versus people who actually want to control our daily lives and to kill commerce. I want you to know that the United States of America, just like Canada, has plenty of people who not only see this for what it is, but are willing to stand up and say, we are not going to go that direction. I would like for you to know that there is a large group of members of Congress and in the United States Senate who well recognize this issue for what it represents. I'm going to give you my email address and my office address in Washington to where you may direct your conversation of opportunities that you see about how these two nations can work stronger together. That should include looking into the future of technology, of utilizing new techniques, new opportunities, but still delivering a product with those elements of safety, of ability to protect the product, and to make sure that it can be shipped and packaged and labeled where it follows traditional packaging guidelines to make sure that it can fit in whatever transportation process we're using. My email address is petesessions@mail.house.gov. I don't ask that you send me things that are extraneous to this matter, but where you have matters where you believe we can work together, if you will reference this call, if you will reference your company, we are going to, in the United States, begin the process of identifying those people who legitimately are for trying to achieve the purposes of a better, brighter future from a conservation or environmental perspective. Number two, ensuring work product is still safe for not only the consumer, but also for the environment. And lastly, making sure that we come together with an answer of a marketplace that would include jobs and opportunity. Secondly, my address in Washington is 2204 Rayburn, RAYBURNHOB House Office Building, Washington, D.C. 20515. I want to thank you very much for allowing me to take a few minutes with you this morning about this important opportunity. I want to assure you that your job and your work with the United States and Canada and the free enterprise system does matter. But most importantly, we have an obligation as conservatives to make sure that our rivers, our oceans are equally taken care of, just as we stand for people and their jobs and technology. So thank you very much. I look forward to coming with you again anytime you ask. And I came to Canada and spoke in Ottawa in 2017. You have a beautiful country, and I'm very proud of the rich relationship that we have between Texas and Canada and my great nation, the United States of America and Canada. Thank you very much, Danielle.
You bet. Thank you, Congressman. Let me just do one follow-up question, just so I can understand the impact it would have on your state if the worst case scenario pans out. I've got a little note here saying that natural gas from the United States and Canada gets converted in Texas and Louisiana into resin pellets and then shipped back to Canada to make a whole manner of products. I've already talked about PPE, but also pipes, siding, decking, flooring. So just give us some sense of why you fear that this initial step of identifying these 6 small products might lead to a greater disruption in this industry.
Well, it's not just this industry. It is for any industry that the environmentalist, and I assume in Canada, environmentalism is a religion, much as it is in the United States. And it has those tones, but as you know, President Biden has stopped what is called the XL pipeline, which has a huge relationship with Canada, a huge reliance on our two great nations, not only utilizing your products, but also servicing the United States. But we could go back to 2017 when there was the tariff put on steel. Well, we found out the more we looked at it that it took a while to notify the administration. 80% of the steel that came back into the United States was an export to Canada to then be finally or refined professionally to bring it back into the United States. Our reliance on each other is enormous. It is enormous for Canadian companies who are here with American workers who are trying to feed their products. But it is no doubt they are going to find not just one or two or five avenues. They are for shutting down economic growth and opportunity, all for this name of communism, socialism, or environmentalism.
All right, Congressman, let me bring in our other politician, and if we can hopefully still keep you so that we can have a bit of conversation.
Yes, ma'am.
Once
And Minister, thank you for joining us, sir.
Yeah, I'm delighted to be able to introduce Minister Prabmeet Sarkaria. He is the Associate Minister of Small Business and Red Tape Reduction, MPP for Brampton South. Prior to joining government, he was a corporate and commercial associate at Miller Thomson LLP, also worked in the finance industry at TD Securities. So Minister Sarkaria, let me throw it over to you. I know that our Environment Minister, Jonathan Wilkinson, he's publicly said, well, if this is just semantics, if this word toxic is causing a problem, we can always change the word. But I don't know if much has been said since then. That was what was said in the initial announcement. Give us some idea of how your government is advocating and how you see this issue.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Danielle, for having me here today, and to the entire team of Canada Strong and Free Network. It's an absolute pleasure. Also, Congressman as well, thank you so much for your words. And I echo that sentiment that both of our nations, there is a mutual reliance and collaboration. There's unforeseen opportunities for economic prosperity between both of our nations. Our premier was just in Texas last year as well, meeting with officials there. We do over $360 billion, the province of Ontario, in trade with the United States of America. So I want to say that we're very thankful for the relationship. Our economies are connected. And also, we need to look forward into issues such as those we are discussing here today to see how we can continue to maintain our competitive edge across the world as the two economies that believe in, I hope, the free market enterprise and what has made us so distinct across the world. I also want to take an opportunity to thank my good friend Jocelyn for bringing me on to this panel as well. She's been an incredible advocate, I must say, for the industry, and she definitely deserves a lot of recognition for that. There's a couple of things I really want to touch on in a broader framework, and then also focusing in on plastics as well. I'm very thankful to belong to a government led by Premier Doug Ford, who believes in not only protecting the environment, but also believes significantly in the economic opportunities that exist here in the province of Ontario, and also with mutually beneficial agreements and partnerships with whether it's states like Texas or the United States of America. Igniting growth and rebuilding our economy and restoring our competitiveness has been something that we've been focused on ever since being elected here, because of, being saddled with 15 years of a government that wanted to overburden businesses. My title directly is related to red tape reduction, which is the primary mission of removing barriers to business success. And I believe what we're speaking to right here echoes what our government is focused on, is making sure that we protect businesses, job creators, and also, at the same time, mutually beneficial, I believe, is protecting the environment. Those can both go hand in hand. We just need sound policy that will benefit everyone and, allow our companies to compete, attract greater market share, and grow both of our economies. When I speak about competitiveness, we look at policies that are being introduced. They're killing jobs. they're stifling economic growth and really ultimately robbing, in Ontario here, hardworking families of opportunities in the process. So we have to be very vigilant. We have to make sure that the regulation that is introduced, policies that are introduced, are not inefficient, are not duplicating, or not adding additional costs to our businesses. So that's what we've really been focusing in Ontario, is really being that voice of reason, against some of the policies that have been put forward by our federal government, and ensuring that our businesses have the opportunity to promote competitiveness, compete internationally, and really develop good jobs across our borders. Now, I think in terms of what we want to discuss here today, I think it's really important from the plastics side of it that we understand how important and integral this part of the economy is all across the country and the province of Ontario, not just for the economic output activity, but increasingly for our way of life. And let's be, frank, from the onset, we know that plastic pollution is a serious environmental issue, but a ban on single-use plastics is not the answer, in our opinion. And this issue is, I believe, best addressed by ensuring that plastics are recovered or recycled, so that this valuable resource does not get sent to landfills or become litter, polluting our environment. And our government feels strongly that great economic, environmental, and social benefits can be achieved for all of Canada by focusing on increasing the recovery and recycling of plastics. Ontario is home to, an innovative chemical and plastic industry that competes globally to attract talent and investments. And, we're really working hard to expand opportunities for growth in this sector. We look at COVID, the pandemic has shown the importance of plastic products in the medical community and preventing, the spread of infections. Husky is a great example of this. Both, if you look at recent studies from Europe and the United States, have shown the benefits of single-use and disposable plastics and the protection of human health, for example, in the food industry. So given these benefits, I believe, responsibly manage plastics to ensure their beneficial uses are not secured at the cost of creating a risk to the environment. And as we recover and rebuild, I think it's going to be critical to listen to voices and viewpoints of stakeholders and businesses that are directly impacted, because they are the most vital part of our economy. And also, as we look at recovery here in the province of Ontario, they're going to be so important to it. So, we're going to continue in our focus to unburden businesses in this sector. We want to look at creating new opportunities in the industry, support competitiveness, and really set up Ontario for a strong recovery and an even stronger future in the years ahead. So Danielle, I'll maybe stop with that and pass it back over to you, but I wanted to share those comments from our government.
Thanks so much for that, Minister. Let me just do a follow-up on just a couple of things, because my sense of the reason why they have used this term toxic in identifying plastics is to give them the same kind of authority over regulating its use as they did over carbon dioxide. If I'm sort of heading in the wrong direction, I'd love for you to correct me on that. But if the minister, Jonathan Wilkinson, has said he's not tied to using that word, have you done any lobbying or advocacy to see how they might be convinced to changing it?
Well, I think one thing that is for sure is, outlining the significant importance of single-use plastics, not only in our economy, but also how important it is to jobs in Ontario. Billions and billions of dollars depend on this industry, thousands and thousands of jobs. So, we can look at the reasons as to why, they're using the word, toxic. I do believe it's political for the most part. And as Congressman mentioned, environmentalism is a religion here in Ontario. We or across both of our countries. I believe in protecting the environment. I'm a strong supporter of protecting the environment, but we also need to have a balanced approach. I don't think you can have any of us disagree with protecting the environment. It's got to be a balanced approach. Protect jobs, and let's ensure that they don't end up in our landfills. Let's look at creative solutions to solving this issue. And we are going to be very aggressively approaching, and have been through, not only the Premier or ministers with our federal counterparts to outline the economic importance of getting this right.
Minister, let me just ask another question. Do you share the Congressman's concern that it's not just these 6 easy to target items? I mean, I think when people look at grocery bags or stir sticks or utensils or straws, they think, oh, well, there's alternatives to those. What's the big deal? Or do you share the Congressman's concern that this is really just the beginning of a broader campaign to stop natural gas being used in all its forms?
Well, we have to be very vigilant. I think, when we look at Alberta and we look at, our provinces, we mentioned the pipeline that was canceled. These are very important projects for the province of Ontario from an economic perspective. It's not just, the province of Alberta. These are issues that we're going to have to face head on. So, even when we look at plastic products, we know the importance of them, from a protection of human health perspective. We know that there are good uses for these products. So let's come to the table. Let's have a policy that will push us forward from an economic perspective while also maintaining the balance of the environment. I'm a strong believer in that, and we've got to be very vigilant on this, because we could sacrifice thousands and thousands of jobs in the province of Ontario across our countries under some of these policies. And so this is why forums like this are so important for us to really address these issues head on.
All right, perfect. Thank you for that, Minister. I might just give Congressman Sessions a chance to respond to that. I don't know if you have an ask of us, Congressman, just sort of having heard where the minister is coming from on this. You've told us that we should contact you to make an ask, but what is your ask of the Canadian public or the Canadian industry? What is it that you want to see? Do you want to see an end to this approach altogether, rescinding the ban on the 6 targeted items, the removal of the term toxic in the act? And just what do you think the path forward is for us to find some common ground?
In fact, I do believe each of those things that you have spoken about is very important, Danielle. But let's go to a larger concept, and that is one that has been really placed upon the United States of America in some respects for the entire world, and that is, and Canada would, I think, well fit within this presumption that I'm making, and that is, America has found a way to use technology time to reduce our reliance on carbon output. We have found a way to technologically advance ourselves and make us better. The oceans are not full of garbage and plastics from Canada or the United States. And yet there are those in this religion that would place huge restrictions on the United States. I think it's interesting. We've just gone through, and I think that you were aware of it in Canada, that we had an Arctic blast in Texas that covered all 254 counties, that virtually took Texas to a standstill of over 100 hours of near zero temperatures. And yet my colleagues on the other side of the aisle blamed Texas for not properly taking care of its citizens, when in fact, only 7 or 8 weeks before that, the President of the United States had made it more difficult to get natural gas, which we live off of in Texas, as opposed to diesel home heating fuel that they pour in all across the Northeast to fuel their winter needs for heating their homes. There, once again, is placing the shackles of advances and technologies and opportunities and jobs and working together. So yes, what my request would be is, I presumptively believe that you're ahead in this cycle by a government and an administration that has gone down this pathway and intends to move down it. And we need your path of least resistance to come apart. And that is to say, we must fight together and we must defeat this. And you are the leading edge people closest, what I would say, to the fire. And yes, I would ask the minister to please, and I will gain his information when I get off this call. I would ask that we work together and see this and actually bring to bear issues of calling their bluff off what they say is an innocuous term that meaningless to know how important it is. And it is, they are very smart. They understand exactly what they're doing, and they are trying to engage themselves further down that economic line to stop free enterprise.
All right. Thank you both for making such excellent points. I know you're so busy and that your staff will be monitoring the rest of the conversation in the event that we get more questions coming into you, but I wanted to be respectful of your time. I know that Minister Sarkaria as well is waiting for the bells. We might see him leave to go and do a couple of votes, but we'll check back with you later. Thank you so much for setting the stage on this. We're going to, in our next half hour, talk with a couple of academics who will weigh in on the issues from a trade perspective, starting off with Phillip Thompson, and then we'll talk about the environmental perspective with Angela Thompson. So first, let me introduce to you Phillip Thompson. He's a policy analyst at Property Rights Alliance, which is based in Washington, D.C., specializing in international intellectual property legislation and trade policy. He holds a BA in International Conflict and Resolution with an MA in International Commerce and Policy, both from George Mason University. And Phillip, let me turn it over to you by asking the question. It seems like it's just a word, it's just a label, it's just virtue signaling, but does it have real implications for the government to, in a formal piece of legislation, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, to label plastics as toxic? What does that mean for our trade relationship if they end up doing that? Phillip, go ahead.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Danielle. Of course, it's much deeper than that. I also want to thank the Canada Strong and Free Network and all the other supporters to making this happen. This issue crossed our desk because in 2019, we launched the International Trade Barrier Index amid heightened trade tensions. And it was an effort so that there could be a tool to highlight real trade barriers that affect businesses, consumers, and society, and the damage they cause. And certainly this measured order, which would declare manufactured plastics, not just single-use plastics, as toxic, is a very prohibitive and dangerous trade barrier. We know on other indexes like Heritage Economic Freedom Index of the World, Canada is a relatively free country. It's 9th there, the USA is 20th on the trade portion. Canada is freer, same with Cato's Human Freedom Index. Canada has a freer trade profile than the United States. On the Trade Barrier Index, which I write and produce through Property Rights Alliance, Canada is 10th, and the USA is 54th out of 86 countries. So that's shocking to a lot of people. How is the United States so far behind? We think of it as a free trade country. That's because the United States is only second behind China for having the most use of non-tariff measures. And this ban on plastic counts as one of those non-tariff measures. We're second only behind China. And we weight it more strongly than those other indexes. And that's because most non-tariff measures are usually innocuous. They're about how much electricity different components can use, labeling requirements for packages. But some of them can be quite restrictive, more than tariffs or other types of barriers you might be used to, and block out entire product classes. I think one that most people know is how European Union prevents exports of chicken from the United States because we clean them with chlorine. The United States also blocks beef from Brazil, which exports it all around the world, but isn't deemed safe for the United States. This barrier on plastic, calling it toxic, doesn't have that taint of protectionism like those do, because it applies to all imports, but also sale in Canada. But it is a marked change and a waste management approach that Canada has been using to combat plastic waste, and is contrary to Canada's commitment to USMCA to pursue a risk-based approach to chemical regulation. And I think that is the crux of it, Danielle, is that using this precautionary principle, Canada is able to declare plastic, manufactured plastic, not just these single-use items, as toxic because of the definition in SEPA where according to SEPA, toxic is anything that is harmful or can constitute a danger to the environment or to human life. If you look up in any dictionary, something that's toxic usually has something that elicits an immune system response or is poisonous. And then under SEPA, there needs to be a determination that this manufactured plastics meets that definition. And that determination used a scientific assessment using the precautionary approach that found actually only 1% of plastic in Canada actually goes into the environment. 99% is captured. And a cool thing I learned doing this research is Canada has the best recycling system in the world and actually relies on feedstock from plastic waste from the United States to go into Canada's recycling system. But again, the main problem, if it's about plastics in the environment, it's only 1% is falling into the environment and being a hazard. And then coming off of that, there's the trade consequences. There's 10 billion in manufactured plastic that leaves the United States to Canada. There's 7 billion in synthetic resins and fibers. And that doesn't count the end-use plastic found in items like cars, packaging, construction material, electronic equipment, so on and so forth. So what we really need to do, the solutions here are, how do we turn back the conversation into a waste management approach? What are the more less restrictive approaches? How can Canada get back to its commitment in USMCA to use a risk-based approach to material regulation? And I think, as Senator Sessions said, that there's a lot that we have in common. We have shared issues on having a clean environment, but this method has a lot of, sets a dangerous precedent for Canada and other countries if they follow through. Thank you.
Well, let me just ask you another question, because I've seen a couple questions come in beforehand, and there's almost what's the big deal about these 6 items? We have other alternatives that we can use. Why would you think that, because we can find alternatives to these 6 items, why would you think that other types of materials are at risk? What bigger picture are you seeing that perhaps those who are just looking at these items might not be seeing?
I think there's 2 main issues here. One is that I think you alluded to earlier, is that right now waste management is something that's handled at the provincial level. And by using SEPA and declaring on this order, it applies to all manufactured plastics, not just single-use plastics that are declared toxic. Under SEPA, using this method, all manufactured plastic now has this federal government regulation to it. And then coming off of that, at any moment, there doesn't need to be a new open comment section if the government wants to expand this ban to plastic found in cars, to other types of plastic packaging. They can just go ahead and do it. So it's a big overreach of government power. And really, again, it's a step away from, if the main problem here is plastic in the environment, and of course that's harmful, according to the government assessment that they did, it's really a summary of research that we know, that plastic is hard to digest, plastic doesn't decompose, and this is how it meets this definition of toxic. They can expand it to these other materials, and other countries can copy this and do the same ban on plastic or manufactured plastic that's exported from Canada, or to other types of items that are considered carbon intensive or other key items. And it could be a big Pandora's box complicating trade relations around the world. Again, it's about a risk-based approach is really the most trade restrictive, and gets to the real problem of what's in the environment causing harm and how do we get it out of the environment.
All right, you've done a perfect setup for our next speaker. Angela Logomasini is a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. She specializes in environmental risk regulation and consumer freedom. She manages safechemicalpolicy.org if you want to check that out. And she also received her PhD in American government from Catholic University of America. She's been with the Competitive Enterprise Institute since 1998. We've been talking a lot about the reason for this approach Canada's taking has to do with pollution, with rivers and oceans being saturated with plastic. I think we mentioned on the previous call, one of the things that I remember is seeing a picture of a turtle with a straw up its nose or other sea creatures who are bound up in fishermen's net. And so I think a lot of people viscerally have seen what has happened to ocean creatures. And so they want to do something. Is this the right thing to do to address that? Angela, go ahead.
Yes, that's an excellent question. We all want to ensure that this stuff stays out of the environment. Ocean pollution is a very serious problem. Unfortunately, banning, arbitrarily picking some products to ban in Canada isn't really going to have a huge impact. And there are going to be some negative consequences associated with the replacement products. In particular, some of these replacement products are going to increase air and water pollution. They're going to increase the volume of waste we produce and have to manage. They're going to increase energy usage, which means if you're concerned about carbon emissions, more carbon emissions. And they are also not, again, it's not going to have a huge impact on plastics in the ocean. Okay, so we're going to look at each one of these things and why they don't solve the ocean pollution problem and actually divert our attention from real solutions. First, let's understand what the ocean pollution problem is. Vast majority of plastic waste going into the ocean is because of poor disposal practices in places outside of Canada and the United States. A couple of people have already mentioned that. So a large portion of this isn't even consumer waste. So we have to deal with that reality as well. A group called Ocean Cleanup did a really good survey of the Pacific garbage patch to determine that's an area where the waste gathers because of ocean currents. So they did a sample to see what really is there. And this is what they found. They found that half of what was in the ocean were fish nets, ropes, and lines, more than half. And then the rest was various other things. Some of it was consumer waste, buckets, crates, bags, other consumer waste. So there's two different things that we need to deal with, two different areas, and they're both very important. So this shows we have to deal with, the fishing industry is one thing. And then we have to say, where is this consumer waste coming from? Where is the primary source of the problem? Science Magazine did a report a few years ago, and they determined, or they concluded, and others have concluded similarly, that a large portion of it comes from China and other Asian nations and developing countries that have open dumps. They estimated 77 to 83% came from China and 11 other Asian nations. So the problem is a disposal problem, and it's mostly overseas, and it is something that has to be addressed. Now, the US contribution in this report was determined to be 1%, and then Canada's contribution was 0.01%, which is really small. I think the Canadian government came up with an estimate at about 0.4%. It's small, it's not, we'd like it to be zero, so it's not insignificant. Of course, we always want to improve what we're doing, but we're doing some things very well. Some things and some mistakes that I think the US and Canada have both made is exporting mixed waste and expecting places like China to recycle it when it was not in a good condition to be recycled. And our last speaker is going to speak about how to have better waste streams or how to organize it better so that we can recycle. But we shouldn't be sending it out somewhere thinking someone else is going to take care of it. We need to make sure if we do, it's got to be recyclable and going somewhere where they're actually going to manage it well. Otherwise, even our waste can end up in the oceans from some overseas source. Very important. But we all need to better manage our wastes. Putting bans out is really kind of a token response that's really not addressing that bigger problem. But let's consider now the adverse impacts of forcing substitute products by removing certain products from the market. Several people have already noted the many benefits of plastics. It's less expensive, it's lightweight, it's sanitary. That's why it won its spot in the marketplace. And these attributes relate also to their environmental profiles. Less expensive is because it uses less energy, so it uses fewer resources to make. It uses less water, creates less air pollution, water pollution. Its lighter weight means less energy to transport. Heavier things and more bulky things require more trucks and so forth, and more energy use. And if you're concerned about carbon, again, both of these things translate into more carbon emissions. Okay, so and again, thinking about space, plastic takes up a lot less space. Think about plastic bags compared to paper bags. There's a huge difference. I was in communication with a plastics bag retailer in New York City when they were going to ban it there. I want to talk about adverse market impacts and how bad it hurt small businesses. It was really, really hurting him. And he told me if they force him to switch to paper, he was going to have 4 to 8 times more storage space and 4 to 8 times more trucks, meaning more trucks on the road, more air pollution, greater energy, and more traffic. None of these things are what we really want to do. It's also concerns about, it's heavier. That means employees who are hauling this around have greater risks of injury, so there's more workplace related concerns. So that's just a real life example. And we all know through common sense, that lighter weight, less energy, these are all good things. So there's also studies that do what they call life cycle assessments. They look at products from cradle to grave to determine the extent of impact on the environment. One study on, I can go through a bunch of them, but I'm just going to highlight one because we don't have a lot of time. Done by a group called Use Less Stuff, determined that when they compared plastic bags versus paper, the paper ones were going to generate 38%, the plastics created 38% less greenhouse gas emissions than the paper bags. They required 6% less water. They consumed 71% less energy during production, and they produced about 1/5 of the amount of solid waste that needs to be managed. Now, some of that will be recycled. It's true that maybe plastic bags might be a little more difficult to recycle, but it's not true that paper bags are easy, a slam dunk either. So a lot of this stuff, if it's going to end up in a landfill where it's not going to decay, because they basically mummify it there, the paper is going to take up more space. So we need to start looking at better options than just these bans. Also consider the difference between cloth, as a cloth bag or a reusable bag, versus a plastic bag. Cloth bags also are more energy intensive to make, so they have to be used multiple times to actually generate over their life cycle better environmental benefits. And a UK study estimated 103 times more. I'm getting, okay, good. You guys can hear me, correct? Okay, sorry. So they have to be used multiple times more. But they're not used, they're usually used about 51 times. So you're getting a net negative. Other factors that were noted earlier were the sanitary effects of these things. The cloth bags tend to harbor bacteria, E. coli. There are cases, there's one case where members of a soccer team were eating food out of a cloth bag, and they had high incidence of the norovirus. They all got food poisoning, which is very serious. So there are real life negative impacts associated with the less sanitary attributes. And the same is true for utensils and cutlery. These are really important in big institutions like hospitals and nursing homes, where they just, even when they clean them, there's still a higher incidence of disease. So at the end of the day, what is the solution? We all talked about it. It's proper waste management. Canada and the United States do a reasonably well job, so maybe we can improve. Getting other nations on board, closing down open dumps, that's a much more difficult problem. It has a lot to do with their stage of development. But at least we can do our part by managing our waste. There needs to be a better effort to police bad actors in the fishing industry. And then there's also private action, and people don't think about this, but it's a really big part of the solution. In America, we had a group called Keep America Beautiful that, starting in the 1950s, worked through public service announcements and cleanup campaigns, and they made tremendous progress. They cleaned up U.S. litter, they claim, has declined by 61% since 1969, which is a great accomplishment, and they continue to do that work. And nowadays, we also have, for the oceans, there are groups that are trying to do similar things. The group called Ocean Cleanup is developing technologies to pull the waste out of the ocean, and hopefully they can do that with minimal impact on wildlife. That's a real challenge, but they say they can get 90% of the ocean pollution cleaned up, and now they're looking into preventing pollution coming in from rivers. And they say that their technologies can clean up 80% of what's coming from rivers and going into the oceans in the first place. So those are ambitious things, and I think they can have real benefits. Bans and regulations, on the other hand, seem to me to be more symbolic and very damaging to private enterprise and individuals' choices, as well as our economy.
Angela, let me see if I can tie it back to what we heard from some of the other speakers, that it seems like, especially when you go through the battery of advantages of plastics and disadvantages of the alternatives, it does seem to point back to the environmentalists just don't like what this is made of. They don't like the fact that it's natural gas. Can you comment on that a bit? Is that really the agenda? Is that ultimately they want to phase out all natural gas?
I think a lot of people are just genuinely naive and well-meaning. And they think that's a quick solution, which it isn't. I do think there is a certain agenda of other people who really it is about fossil fuels. But the reality is the other products use fossil fuels too to be produced and so forth. So it's not really a fair approach that they're taking. There may be something else involved. Maybe they want to cripple us economically. I don't know. Maybe there's another more nefarious agenda, but at the end of the day, if you just look at the numbers, the data, we're not going to achieve the goals we want to achieve, which are really important goals.
Fabulous. Thank you for that, Angela. I want to just get John Galt in before we get to some of the questions. We've got a ton of great questions coming in, because John Galt is President and Chief Executive Officer of Husky Systems, a global world leader in the supply of equipment that converts raw materials, mostly polymers, into food, beverage, personal care, home care, and medical devices. He's named as a co-inventor on 171 patents and owns a mechanical engineering degree from Ryerson Polytechnical University in Canada. John, I've got a few direct questions for you stemming from this conversation, because I recognize the fear that the Americans have that if Canada goes down this route, then it will be environmental pretext for a whole variety of different trade laws and trade restrictions and non-tariff barriers that can come in. But normally you do those kinds of restrictions because you want to benefit your domestic industry. I just want people to understand whether or not you think you're going to benefit at all from this label of plastic being toxic or any of the approach that the government is taking. John, what do you say to that?
Well, thank you, Danielle, and thank you for inviting me here. No, of course, the label is going to be nothing disastrous to the Canadian plastics industry, and in fact, to Canadian people in waste management. So I think a lot of the panelists have correctly pointed out we have a waste management issue. If you really look at the total environmental footprint that goes into protecting our food, ensuring our medical devices are supplied, and things of that nature, that's the way to look at the problem in terms of the first time use. There's also a misnomer regarding the principal concept of single use. Most plastics in use today can be used infinitely, over and over again with the right recycling system. So it's a matter of collection and recycling. And I think if you think about the Canadian industry, just to put it at large, it's about a $35 billion contributor to our national GDP, which is not insignificant. It's 5% of manufacturing GDP, a big number. Second of all, it involves about 1,900 small and medium-sized organizations. And as we know, those are the organizations that have been devastated through the actions in the last year around COVID. And if we think about it in an even different way, there's about 370,000 people directly or indirectly employed in the supply of the plastics industry in Canada. So it's a big part of our industry. And matter of fact, we actually have some world leaders here. If you look at companies like Ice River Springs, it's been producing containers from 100% recycled content for over a decade now. In other words, they take these bottles, and with these bottles, they collect them from our Blue Box program in Ontario, and been producing containers for over 10 years. And the other thing that a lot of people don't think about is that once this legislation, this SEPA designation as toxic, was tabled, all of that investment in recycling technology got put on hold, which is ridiculous. If we realize we have a waste management issue, if we realize we have leaders in Canada when it comes to the advanced technologies to manage them and practical experiences, understanding how it's done, to have companies like Ice River, who was also in the midst of making an investment in a bag recycling facility and also had new ideas for a recyclable takeout container, something we've all used a lot in the last year, all of those investments got put on to hold. And I think probably the last thing to mention when we talk about the impact on the Canadian industry is let's look at medical devices. You know, about 73% of all medical devices in the world today are manufactured out of plastic. And plastic has been gaining share over other materials for the last 20 years because of its combination of hygiene its convenience to manufacture, but also the fact that it's unbreakable and it replaced glass in a lot of areas where you can imagine having something broken in a lab environment is a real problem when it comes to cleanup. So the other issue is, we're highly dependent today on foreign companies for the supply of these critical medical devices. And we've seen it during this pandemic as we're basically last in the line relative to any other developed nation in getting a lot of the vaccines and the distribution systems. I've spoken to customers of ours who've said, if this legislation is going to be tabled, and it could essentially, with the whim of a political figure, make me a toxic and hazardous system and essentially turn all of that investment into naught, why would I set up new business here? So it's further stifling the investment in the supply of these essential items that we need nationally. It's stifling the further investment in recycling technology. And where's the alternative to the 370,000 people that rely upon the industry today for their well-being?
All great points. John, can you elaborate a bit more on some of the options that are under development for recycling? Because I think this is the frustration, and I've seen a few questions come in about this, is when we started realizing that we were offshoring all of our plastics to China and Malaysia and Philippines, I think this is where it came to a head, is that when China said, we're not going to take this anymore, and then when we got into this scrap with the Philippines, because we were supposed to be sending them over plastics and we sent them over bins that had adult diapers in them, it created a big black eye for us. And we began to realize that as the clamshell containers for fruit and vegetables were piling up, we don't really have a very effective way of dealing with those things in Canada. And I think people are asking the question, well, why not? Because I think that's where the linkage is if we can't figure out a way to deal with our plastic waste locally, then maybe we should just produce less of it. What is the alternative? What you talked about 3 different ways that we're potentially developing to deal with plastics. Tell us what those are and where we're at.
Sure. Well, I guess there's 2 ways to look at the problem. The first thing, and the biggest problem today, is to get enough supply of post-consumer materials. And as you correctly called out, many of the materials we have today are mixed, meaning they're in with food waste, we're in with other items, and they're not as easily extracted from that commingled waste stream today for the purposes of recycling. So I think the first thing that Canada has to do is, on a provincial level, harmonize our waste management practices, or more correctly, I think we're thinking about the term incorrectly, waste, resource management. Because if the vast majority of the solid waste being produced today is in fact materials that can be cleansed and reused over and over again, why do we consider them waste? Why are we still using a 40-year-old way of thinking about waste management? Why isn't that resource management? So I think the first step is harmonizing the way we collect, what we collect. I work 15 minutes away from where I live on a farm, and what I can put in my blue box is entirely different here from what's over there. So that's the first step. Now, once we get the materials back, there's really 3 fundamental approaches to managing them and getting them back or getting their energy out of them. The first one is mechanical recycling. It's the most mature. It's been around for over a decade, and it's really where you take the materials back, you cut them up, you separate them from other potential contaminants, and then you basically sanitize them through elevated temperatures and vacuums and things like that to get a pure material that can be reintroduced into the stream. And when I mentioned, for example, Ice River Springs, they're ones that have been using that mechanical recycling systems for over a decade. Countries like Norway and Germany today collect over 97% of things like plastic bottles and reuse them through exactly those same mechanisms. So the second technology that's being invested in, and there's about 10 companies that are developing advanced solutions for what I'll call chemical recycling or advanced recycling. And this is really where they take the raw material that is plastic and they break it down into its primary components. So instead of dealing it as a finished plastic, they break it down into the elements that created that plastic. By doing that, you can easily separate out all other forms of contamination. And that's very powerful, because what it means is that even if there are some plastics that are commingled with other waste items, this form of advanced recycling actually allows you to separate them and extract only the valuable materials and direct the other materials to streams where they can again be used. Now, most of those are still in a pilot level today, but there is one company of ours in Turkey that's actually started up the first large-scale commercial operation for advanced recycling. And so we'll know soon whether those great ideas that are maturing are actually ready for full prime time. And then the last form of recycling that's widely used, and again in Europe, I mentioned places like Germany and Norway, is waste to energy. So when you've extracted all the valuable materials, when you've put them back into the stream to be manufactured into new sanitary items, whether that's through mechanical or advanced recycling, the last element is to extract the energy. And high energy, very efficient incinerators that don't put much in the way into the environment through their scrubbers, but at the same time extract all of the remaining energy, which of course is significant given the feedstock that's used for plastic is in fact, fossil fuels.
That's excellent. Let me then we'll go into some of the questions with a panel discussion with all of you, and you can just sort of wave at me to let me know if you want to get in on it. But let me bring it back to Phillip, because you just heard John say one of the issues we need to do is harmonize our collection and recycling practices across our provinces, and then move to using some of these different types of methods to recycle them or reuse them. Would you perceive those as being additional trade barriers, or do you think that there is a way for us to be proactive to make sure that Canada and the US are also operating in tandem? How do you see it, Phillip?
I think that type of approach would be least restrictive. The United States already exports 13% of our plastic waste goes to Canada as a feedstock to that recycling industry, as John pointed out. Canada, I think we're all our best critics, but Canada really has top of the line recycling system and industry there, and there's a lot of innovation there. And the more that we can collaborate and not be declaring plastic as a toxic, but see it as a resource management, we can both work together on those and even compete who's going to be the best recycler.
Angela, let me put it to you. Do we also need to have a bit of a reality check? I think that there's this sense, everybody wants to get to 100% success. That we have this idea that utopia is achievable, and it's sort of the natural thing we should be striving for. Do you think it's achievable to have 100% of the plastics that we produce recycled or reused or turned into energy? Or do we just have to accept that some of it may ultimately have to be landfilled?
Well, I think the thing is, it's not whether I accept or not accept. I think it needs to be a market process. I always advocate competition between your waste disposal options. And recycling competes for some portion of the waste, landfilling will compete for some portion, and the waste energy will compete for some portion. When we start to try to force one or the other, we can have a lot of problems. What John was talking about was great. He's got all kinds of innovative options coming online for recycling, but at the end of the day, we need to make sure we manage our waste well and not let it get in the ocean. So until we get to that point where we can increase it to a higher level, or whatever level we desire, we're going to have to use those other options. And John's point was pretty clear too, that some portion is going to go to a waste to energy facility or to some other vehicle for managing it. But my main point is we need to manage it. And my advocacy on the waste disposal side is markets and competition between all parts of that. Once we start to command and control, that's when we get problems.
So John, can you comment on that too? Because I think people thought we were a lot further along in some of these recycling options than we are. I mean, to be at a point where we've got 10 that are looking at this chemical recycling process, and only one of them could be at a point where they might actually be able to roll it out. You mentioned the company in Turkey. Is that an indication that the market's not working here, that it just isn't very cost effective to invest in these kinds of recycling options? Does that mean that it just makes more sense to produce plastics from the original natural gas source? Does it mean that you need government subsidies to make some of these things worthwhile? How do we solve that piece? Because it seems to me if there was a free market solution, we'd have had it by now. What am I missing, John?
Okay, well, if we look at best practices globally, so Husky exports 99% of the equipment it manufactures to countries around the world, and pretty well every country in the world that manufactures a packaging article, a medical item, likely has one of our pieces of equipment. So we had an opportunity to put together over the course of the last couple of years a series of best practices. And really what we found is, if we think about what's possible today, there are typically four things that exist. First of all, there's these convenient and harmonized collection systems. What's been discovered is that when people are given the option, they'll do the right thing. I mean, again, just look at Ontario. If you look at the Blue Box program, unfortunately, the Blue Box program is only extended to single family dwellings today. It's not multi-family dwellings, nor is it commercial or retail outlets. But in single family dwellings, there's about a 73% diversion rate, purely based upon voluntary behavior. If you, on the other hand, look around the globe for better numbers, if you introduce a value on the package, in other words, a deposit system, recovery rates today are demonstrated in the world to increase to about 97%. And that's a combination of both people wanting to do the right thing and that people that don't do the right thing, having others collecting those items because there's value on them, because they can return those items for value. So that's the first step. The second step is widely used is mechanical recycling technology. So I can tell you today that over the course, today and over the course of the next couple of years, I think it would be reasonable to expect that 25 to 30% of all of, for example, these bottles manufactured in any mature economy is manufactured out of post-consumer materials. So there's a huge investment going on right now in mechanical recycling technologies. It's really unprecedented. As a matter of fact, many of the manufacturers of systems are sold out for 3 years. So billions and billions of dollars are going into it. And Canada, as I said, has world leaders. It's struggling to get more material. And I think the last thing that has proven highly effective is to, first of all, establish minimum recycled content requirements for all packaging materials. And I think if you do that, especially, what that drives is motivation. And in terms of the economics, I can tell you for a fact that the companies that are successfully recovering post-consumer materials and making new packages out of them are actually doing it at a lower cost than virgin materials. So again, if you look at principally the issue of the technology, the collection, if you can get an adequate supply of materials, the re-energy you have to put back in to reprocessing the material and the recovery means that the cost of the bale you buy, the raw baled up piece of plastic, and the conversion cost can actually be less than virgin. And it's really coming down just to a shortage of materials. If you look in the US today, A-grade post-consumer recycled material is actually selling at a premium to virgin materials because it's such high demand. So that gives you the sense that there's an enormous pent-up interest that's really limited today by the access to the materials themselves. And that's why I'm such a strong advocate of harmonizing the waste management practices, or resource management, as I like to call it.
Can you just clarify what is that particular product? What is it, so that we understand what the value is? When you say that this recyclable material is more value than virgin material, what is that? Is that milk jugs? Is it plastic deck boards? Is it plastic fences? What is it that we should be paying attention to that the industry really needs?
Okay, well, first of all, there's many families of plastics, but I'm talking about the most common thermoplastics, because if you look at most of the plastics produced in the world today, they are common thermoplastics. Materials like polyester. Polyester is what this bottle is made of. It's also what your fleece is manufactured of. Polyester is used in a wide variety of applications. It's so hygienic, it's used in stents in hearts today for heart surgery and artery surgery. So that's the most commonly used plastic in the world. Many of the references have been around those family of materials, which are all fully recyclable indefinitely with very low energy and very well matured processes. You then to get into other families of materials like the high density polyethylenes. These are things like, or polyethylenes in general, the pails you might find if you go to one of your, let's say, home supply stores, and you get those large industrial pails, or the paint cans. Those are a family of materials by the name of polyethylenes. And of course, if Vess was on here, he'd talk to you a lot about vinyl and other materials. So really, if you look at it, significant, or the majority of all of the plastics used in the world today fit into probably 4 or 5 primary categories, and they make up the majority of the materials. So if we could get those back, the vast majority of solid waste that is plastic today could be recovered and reused.
All right, that's good. So some of us who have out of fashion shirts that are made of polyester, rather than donating them on to one of the agencies that collect them, maybe we should be thinking of donating it on so it can be recycled. Let me go back to Philip, because I think that there's a number of things that have been put on the table, and I'm just wanting to understand if we don't want to create potential solutions that are going to cause additional trade barrier problems. So there's a couple things I'd like you to respond to from what John had suggested. What about this idea of, I think they call it expanded producer liability, having those who use the plastics in their packaging developing mechanisms so they become responsible for making sure that they're recycled. And maybe it's just a simple matter of you put a 5-cent charge on some of the materials so that there's a collection depot and an incentive to get it back. And then the other one he mentioned was minimum content requirements. So if you're producing plastics, having a certain percentage that has to be made out of recyclable materials. Is that an active discussion in the United States?
It's put forward a few times. I think a lot of domestic companies might find it as an unfair burden to have extended producer responsibility. I want to circle back to your question for Angela, because about well, will we ever get to 100%? Because according to Canada's own assessment on manufactured plastic, they found that only 1% of this plastic ends up wrongly in the environment. So really, if we pursue a risk-based approach, this could really just be a matter of, we just need a couple more blue bins by the beach and by the rivers where this ends up being disposed.
Can you deal with that other aspect though, about the minimum content requirements? Is that something that would, I mean, you mentioned having the expanded responsibility might be seen as onerous, but what about having a requirement that when you're producing your plastic deck boards or plastic pails, a certain percentage has to be from recyclable material? Would that be something that would be positively received?
I can see that causing some bottlenecks as well, because right now things are made one way, and that might cause a lot of supply chains to be disruptive in order to meet those requirements. And of course, if other countries have different requirements, that might cause a lot of different types of materials or variations to be made. And again, I think that what we have here is the wrongful use of using precautionary measures and picking and choosing which industries are affected by these measures. Right now, parallel to this, we have the global COVID vaccine. We have this COVID pandemic, and a lot of countries are using, when vaccines are being approved, they're using a risk-based approach. We saw AstraZeneca targeted last week because there's been people, an association with blood clotting, but really when you do the science, you find that blood clotting is no more prevalent in people that receive vaccines than those that don't. And so there's no need for a real ban. And we should apply that same methodology to plastics and other industries. If we keep using this precautionary approach, then we wouldn't have any of these vaccines. And we wouldn't have the innovation that John is talking about when companies are competing to make the next breakthrough in recycling technology.
I think we're getting close to being out of time. So let me just give the last word to Angela to see if you can bridge a bit of the gap here, because I think we've got this integrated market with Canada and the US. We've got pressure on our businesses to move a little bit faster. The Americans want the market to be in operation a little bit more. How do we create a path forward so that we're in sync with one another and still meeting this public desire to see less diverted to landfills and more being diverted to some kind of useful purpose, either repackaged and reconstituted or used in energy production? Can you bridge this divide for us with some sort of sensible policy that would make sense across, just recognizing that we've got kind of different political speeds that we want to move at in both countries?
Yes. Well, I've worked on this issue for about 30 years. And the problems we're discussing today are the problems I was discussing in 1990 something. The reality is we can't really, we think that we can sort of pick and choose what the market's going to look like, but and that's what we've tried to do in our country. We've tried to actually have like 30-year plans like the Soviets do for managing their kind, to manage our garbage. I've always advocated a true free market and competition. And, you know, as in the commercial field, in the commercial sector, recycling has always been higher than in the consumer portion of it. It's just really hard to collect and sort waste and get it to market. And as John was saying, he's having basically a shortage of things that he wants. I mean, ultimately, it comes down to price. I mean, if he's willing to pay a certain price for it, people are going to sort it. Unfortunately, governments are so deeply involved in waste management that it's not really driven always by markets, and politics come in, and we don't always get the honest answer as to what's happening, like sending waste over to China saying it's going to be recycled when it's mixed. And people think it's great, they just throw it in the blue bin, but throwing everything in one bin is probably not the best way to do it. Maybe collection centers or something. But ultimately, I've always advocated letting a marketplace select it. I don't have a huge problem with some portion going in a landfill as long as it's sanitary. I'd rather it go there than go in the ocean. And I think we all have a problem with it going in the ocean. So I think people are looking for different solutions, and hopefully the private sector will come together with the collection side of it. If we had private hauling and collection completely private, maybe there'd be better relationships going on. I advocate privatization.
All right, Angela, what a great note to end on. Working on it for 30 years, which means we're not going to solve it with a simple change in legislation in Canada. So thank you so much for that context. That was Angela Logomassini, Senior Fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. We also had Phillip Thompson, Policy Analyst at the Property Rights Alliance, and John Galt, President and Chief Executive Officer of Husky Systems. I'm going to hand it back to, I'm Danielle Smith, and I'm just going to hand it back to Troy Lanigan to finish us off for today. Thank you so much for such an excellent conversation. And I think we moved a little bit closer to finding some common ground and some solutions. Troy, take it away.
Thank you, Danielle, and to all our panelists. That was a great discussion. I learned so much, including that there's polyester in my chest. I had no idea, John, so now I know. Hey, I wanted everyone to know the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada has a petition opposed to the plastics ban. I'll ask for that to be put into the chat to connect with all of you. Also, we encourage you to reach out to our elected officials. Contact the Federal Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Jonathan Wilkinson. We'll put his email address and phone numbers in the chat as well right now. I also want to thank our partner organizations, the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses, Americans for Tax Reform, and again, our sponsor, Modern Miracle Network, for making these calls possible. Now, because of our conference coming up in April, I talked about off the top, our next exchange call will be in May, and information will be sent out to you at that time. We look forward to seeing you all at that time. Again, thank you for a really, really interesting conversation today and for your participation. We will talk to you in May. For all, bye for now.